Hi guys, today I bring you a beginner-friendly guide for the Summoner Necromancer, also known as the Zoomancer. This guide has been designed specifically with Path of Exile beginners in mind, so even if you have never played Path of Exile, you should be able to follow this guide all the way through to the Path of Exile endgame. And to make sure this build is simple and accessible, we are specifically not utilizing any complicated or difficult to scale mechanics. So we are not using Animate Guardian, we are not using Spell Suppression, we are using relatively simple Spectres only. This is a classic old school skeletons, zombies, basic Spectres, armor-based Necromancer. However, while this build does aim to be simple and straightforward, that does not mean it's a weak build or that it's for beginners only. Absolutely not. Anybody can play this build. This build, while not as strong as it was at some points historically, is still very, very solid, and with enough investment and scaling is perfectly capable of clearing T17 maps and all Maven invitations, including Deathless Feared, which I'm showcasing somewhere above right about now in the background if you want to see that. And before we go into some details about the build, as a final note to this introduction, I will mention that the path of building code for this build is fully standalone. So if you know how to use PoB, you basically do not even really need to watch the rest of this video, and you certainly do not need to visit any of external pages like PoE Vault or Maxroll or anything like that. You can just import the build and everything you need will be in that PoB. You will not miss anything or need any other references. So before we begin, just very quickly, what you need to follow this build. If you're a total Path of Exile beginner, there are only two things you will need to have to follow this build and get yourself started. First of all, you will need Path of Building. This is a community-made Path of Exile tool used to easily create and share Path of Exile builds. It's very complex, but extremely powerful, and basically all Path of Exile build guides use it. So you will definitely need it. The download link for PoB and the import code for this Zoomancer build can be found in the description of this video. And second of all, I strongly recommend getting a loot filter because, to be honest, Path of Exile gets pretty unplayable pretty quickly without a loot filter. And again, you can find a link to the most popular loot filter, which is NeverSinks, in the description down below. So what are the strengths of this build? Mostly the most important one, and why I chose this one for like a beginner, new player kind of guide, is because it's very easy, it's very safe and simple to play. So that's a great point if you're not that familiar with the game. It's also a very good bosser. It's very safe, good bosser. You can stay back and let your minions do the damage, and they do a lot of boss damage. It basically deletes most bosses in the game, anything other than Ubers. In addition, it's a very well-rounded character that's good at most mechanics and Atlas strategies. This means there isn't really any content in the game that you can't access or that you're bad at. You're basically just pretty good at everything. It doesn't mean that you're not like amazing at anything, but you are very good. You will be able to access basically all of the game's content. Next point, it's a great league starter, which means that you don't need to have another character to feed it money and items to get started. You can start this character as your first character ever or first character of the league. And finally, which I also think is a very important point for beginners, this build has a very nice and steady progression curve, so you can just gradually keep investing more and more into this build over time, and it does scale and get stronger and stronger. There is no major drop-offs or major brick walls and progression that will stop you from getting stronger for days and days on end. It's just very nice and steady. It's not like like a staircase of progression. It's like a nice smooth curve. So yeah, that's very important to beginners, I think. So now, actually, let's take a look at the path of building that I've prepared for this build. And first of all, we will look at the notes section, which is probably the most important section. I mean, this is especially going to be useful for beginners, and this is where I've put the most of the effort in for this guide. And it's basically a huge dump of information, specifically, explaining everything about this build that you could possibly want. So we're just going to have a quick look through it just to give you a feel for what's in here. We have a quick build overview. So we have the strengths and weaknesses of the Zoomancer. Here we have a leveling checklist and notes, and I think this is probably what's going to be really useful for new players. We basically have a point by point or checklist of what you should be doing at each level, which gems you should be picking up as rewards, which gems you should be buying from NPCs, at which level, what you should be linking them with, a few notes about which are the difficult parts of the game, when to get your ascendancy, stuff like this. You know, it goes on in a lot of detail for the first few acts. Then we sort of start, you know, toning it down because fewer things change over time, obviously, as we progress through the campaign. But nevertheless, important notes, you know, I mentioned here. For example, something I totally missed in the patch notes and I wasn't aware of, and it frustrated me to no end. In Act 9, that we can now get that trigger socketed spell craft recipe in the refinery area that I was not aware of, and I spent the first few days of the league trying to identify, unveil a bunch of items to get this craft, but only to realize that it's now accessible in Act 9, so basically make sure to pick it up from there. Then we have a little section on early maps talking about which things to prioritize as you get to the maps, you know, what to focus on to make your build come online. And at this point, I will mention that, you know, when you first enter maps, it'll probably be pretty easy. When you get to like tiers 7, 8, 9, this sort of level, it might start getting a bit difficult until you get the Covenant, until you get your Uber Lab, because you won't have quite enough damage. So make sure to basically use this little checklist and make sure that you're picking up all these things that you need to make your build feel good. Then we have a little section on the passive trees. There's not actually too much to talk about the passive trees. They're pretty straightforward. The Necromancer doesn't really need to respec very much. However, there is a little point at which you're starting to assign a bunch of jewels, and if you don't yet have the jewels, then I have a little mention here of which other passive notables to go for if you don't yet have your jewels. Excuse me. And when we look at the skill trees, I will show you this in a moment. We're going to be looking at the skill trees in about 2-3 minutes. After that, we have a little section on skill gems where I discuss basically, I don't discuss everything here because there's no need. You know, I'm not going to be explaining how a raised zombie works, right? It's pretty obvious. But I do have a few mentions here of some of the abilities that you may not really know how to use and when to use. So I've got a little section here, you know, diving a little bit deep into some of these, explaining how, you know, the mana reservation of Vitality Clarity works and which level of those you want, stuff like this. I'll have a section of explaining how to fit your auras in, where to get your increased mana reservation. Then we have a little section on items. Basically, in here I basically mention which item base and item level you really want in the end game. Obviously, as you progress into the campaign, it doesn't matter as much. So we run a couple of unique items. We run the Covenant body armor unique, which is very, very important. That basically makes your build come online. You really want that one as soon as possible. It's not super expensive, but it's not like super cheap either. It's around 20 chaos, I believe, at this point, which is not too bad. We also have the belt, Darkness Enthroned, which is also a few chaos, a little bit less important to start with than the Covenant. Then we have the cluster jewels, and the cluster jewels are very important. I suggest, you know, you maybe read up a little bit about cluster jewels if you don't know them, especially this medium one. I found this one really changed the game for me when I finally socked that in. It has Life from Death and Blessed Rebirth passives, which really help with minion survivability. So definitely try to focus on those quite quickly as well. Then we have a little section on scaling the builds of the aspirational upgrades that you can do. So you can read this once you're sort of reaching like T17 maps, for example. We mentioned the Pantheon and Bandits. We talk about Atlas strategies a bit, and then we have a bit FAQ. This is mostly about like Spectres stuff, explaining how it works. A little bit section about Animate Guardian and why we don't use it and how to use it if you did want to use it. A bit of section about viability and stuff. And just on this note, I guess I'll quickly mention for the Spectres, I personally use 1x Perfect Guardian Turtle, which gives us Determination aura mostly. I use 1 Arena Master, which gives us basically buffs to damage, and I use 2x Carnage Chieftain for Frenzy Charges, which is basically just utility and damage as well. Now, this is a pretty simple setup, in my opinion, and pretty easy to get. So that's what I recommend. Obviously, there are way more complicated setups that you can run, but that is a very, very complicated topic that could just deserve a video of its own, which Spectres to use. If you're a beginner, you pick up those 4 Spectres. They will serve you just fine. So yeah, this is the notes section. Now, let's take a quick look at the tree section. As I mentioned already, it's pretty simple. I mean, Necromancer doesn't really have a particularly difficult, tree. You definitely want to get Lord of the Dead first to get that maximum number of raised zombies and skeletons around level 10. Then we sort of go a little bit to the left of the tree. We pick up Sacrifice, Spiritual Command, and Grave Pact. At this level, we then start sort of getting a little bit more damage, a little bit more health as well. Then we start getting some max resistances, some more health and defenses as well. Some block. some mana reservation, some extra health in this one. And then finally we get to this level 64 tree, and at level 64, because Necromancer uses quite a lot of jewels and cluster jewels, already at level 64 you want to start thinking about assigning some of those jewels, which is a little bit early. And obviously at level 64, if this is your first character, you're probably not going to have any money to be buying all these jewels. So if you can't afford it, you know, once you get to the 6477 tree, probably just, you know, don't allocate all these jewel sockets here in a bunch of places. Instead, there's a few passives that you could go for. For example, we have this Enduring Bond here, which is going to give you some minion damage. Here on the right, we have Indomitable Army, which is also going to give some survivability to your minions. Here we have Combat Stamina, which is going to give you some armor, max life, regen, which is pretty good. And also here, a little bit to the right, we have Constitution, which is also a great life node. So if you can't afford all those jewels, if you don't have you know, if you don't have them to slot them in, there's no point getting those notables. Just pick up some of these other minion-based notables to start with, and then once you have your jewels, you can unspec, respec, remove those notables, and yeah, and just assign the jewels. So this is what the jewel setup looks like. Later on, we have one large cluster jewel, one medium cluster jewel, and one small cluster jewel. And with regards to the ascendancy, I usually begin with, well, I recommend beginning with Commander of Darkness. This gives you a lot of elemental resistances to start with, which is just makes campaign really simple. You know, you also run in Purity of Elements. You basically don't have to worry about reses in the campaign, which is very nice. I then go for Mindless Aggression in the Cruel Lab, Bone Barrier in the Merciless Lab, and Unnatural Strength in the Uber Lab. I suppose you could probably switch those two around, Bone Barrier and Unnatural Strength as the third and fourth if you wanted, although this third one is really nice with the leeching and the extra energy shield for minions. So I probably wouldn't, but if you really want to, you can do that. And yeah, this is basically the tree section. Now we're just going to take a quick look at the skill section. Everything here should be pretty self-explanatory. We have 4 different setups. We have like an Act 1 to Act 3 setup. You know, where you're basically relying on some free links. You've got the Raised Zombie with chance to poison and minion damage. You've got Summon Raging Spirit. Summon Raging Spirit is probably going to be your main ability for damage, at least in the first few acts. So you really want to get that free linked as soon as possible, ideally with Infernal Legion and minion damage. If you're not able to get a free linked blue item, you can also add, if you, for example, have 2 blue and 1 green, you can add chance to poison. So, for example, you could have Summon Raging Spirit, Infernal Legion, and chance to poison as your third link. So that's just something to keep in mind. You probably want to be using Clarity for some mana regen, you know, Purity of Elements as well. It's pretty basic stuff. Then we have Act 4 to 10, sort of add a few more things here. We add in Feeding Frenzy with Chaos Golem. Maybe if you can fit in, we add in already an Immortal Call and cast when damage taken. For this one, make sure that they stay at low levels, at least at the start in the campaign. You can level them up later in the end game, but you basically want to be triggering it. You can read up the description to understand why this is happening. We're using Shield Charge for movement, Frostblink for movement as well, Clarity, Vitality, and Convocation as well. Then once we reach early maps, I personally usually remove Summon Raging Spirit in early maps if I can afford to, and start, you know, filling out my sockets and links with some other abilities. If you want to, you can keep Summon Raging Spirit until a little bit later if it helps you. But generally speaking, this early maps skills, you don't want to stay in that too long. This is just a transition to the final end game skill section. So I recommend, you know, only staying in this early maps for ideally a few hours at most. And then you've got the basically final one where everything is listed exactly how I use it, how I recommend it. Not much breathing room. There's a lot of socket pressure in the Zoomancer, so you probably can't switch out too much of it. But this is my suggestion, and you can use that once you're finally sort of in the end game. You've got all your sockets, etc. And finally, we're going to take a quick look at the items section. So again, we have 4 item sets. First of all, we have a leveling set. Not very important, this one. I mean, we're basically going to be res capped through the first ascendancy and Purity of Elements. So we're basically just kind of trying to get some health, some all stats, you know, some dexterity and intelligence and strength to fit your gems. In your weapon and your shield, you want to be getting as much minion damage as possible. If you're lucky, you might get +1 to level of minions in your helmet, wand, or shield, which would be very useful, so make sure to be looking out for those. But in general, you know, your leveling is pretty basic stuff. Basically just health, maybe some extra res if you're missing a couple of points here and there. You're probably going to want a life flask, a mana flask, and then probably quicksilvers to fill it out. Maybe an armor flask as well if you want to. Moving on, early maps, sort of will fill out some of the flasks a little bit better. We start switching to, you know, slightly better gear. At this point, you'll probably need to have some reses on some of your items. But again, still basically just plus minion damage, plus life, plus res, doesn't change very much. Then once we hit the early end game, this is when you actually expect to have you know, all the unique items that you need. So as I mentioned, the Covenant, super important. We also pick up the Jinxed Juju as the helmet, which is very useful. The other alternative for the amulet is Ashes of the Stars, but that is a very end game item. So I wouldn't really worry about that. I would focus on getting the Jinxed Juju first. We're also using the Darkness Enthroned belt. We pick up the Rumi's Concoction flask, and then we already have a couple of unique jewels as well. Watcher's Eye, not super important. Don't worry about the Watcher's Eyes. That's a very end game jewel. You can skip that one and just use a regular Ghastly Eye jewel. But this one is important. This is Amanamu's Gaze, which is very good, and it increases damage of your minions very significantly. Do try to pick that one up. This is quite an expensive item. I believe last I looked it was about 4 divs. So, you know, it's important. Don't worry about it too terribly much. Definitely pick up your Covenant, Jinx, Juju, and Darkness Enthroned first. But once you have those and you sort of rest of your items are looking pretty good, then definitely do make sure to pick up that Amanamu's Gaze. And then we have a final endgame build with all of the items. And as you can see, the DPS, for me, it's showing about 22 million. Obviously, that's quite a high DPS. And obviously, this is actually a bit lower in real life because, you know, minion AI, the pathing and stuff, they don't always hit. They have to get to the enemy and stuff. But the DPS is pretty good. I have to say, you know, I'm not surprised to see that number from my experiences playing of the game. Seeing how the bosses melt, you know, the DPS on this build is good. You're definitely going to be able to blow up your bosses. Obviously, I will mention that this very final endgame build here, there's probably close to like 50, 60 div worth of gear in here. So obviously, this is, you know, quite a high investment build. This sort of early endgame you can probably put together with like 10 div or something like that. And that's already going to be, you know, already looking at a very good DPS as well. It's probably a bit lower than this if you don't have all the jewels quite as well rolled. And yeah, and in early maps, again, this is probably a lot lower than the 6 million because, you know, you're not going to have all these jewels here. If you remove the jewels, you're looking at about 2 million DPS, which is still very solid for like an early maps build. But again, minions, you know, they don't get to your enemy straight away, so it takes a little bit of ramp up time. And yeah, this is the item section. And that about sums up everything in the PoB that I wanted to talk about. And yeah, as mentioned, this build was designed with absolute Path of Exile beginners in mind. So if anything at all is not clear to you, or if you have any feedback about the build or any issues, feel free to ask either in the comments or on my Discord server, link to which you can also find in the description down below. I will be more than happy to answer any of your questions. I'm usually, you know, very often on my computer, so I usually answer at most within a couple of hours unless I'm sleeping. And yeah, anyway, to close out the video, I will now play you a few showcases from the build, you know, a tier 17 map, a couple of invitations, etc., so that you can see the build in action. And thank you very much for watching, and I hope this video helped some of you to get into the Zoomancer, which I think is an excellent, well-rounded build. And see you in the next one. Bye-bye.
Survival. This has been most entertaining.